Hey folks, in this video we're going to be discussing strategies for importing data from one Google Sheets workbook into another. So we're going to be focusing on static methods as well as dynamic methods. So our static method is going to leverage the import option in the file menu, and our dynamic method is going to leverage the import range function within Google Sheets, which allows you to reference a spreadsheet URL and a range within the spreadsheet in order to dynamically pull data into your environment. So we are going to be working out of this data workbook, which has approximately 30 rows of values. So what we're going to do is we're going to explore our static methods first, and then we'll wrap up with import range. So I'm going to export the data out of my source by using the download method in the file menu, and I am going to select a CSV. CSVs are optimal for importing data using the file method. So I'm going to go back to our workbook. I'm going to go to the file menu. I'm going to go to import, go to upload, select browse, get my data set, and then we're going to be met with this import file prompt. So we're just going to focus on the import location options, and we're going to be focusing on 4 of these. We're going to use insert new sheets, we're going to replace current sheet, we're going to append to current sheet, and we're going to replace data at selected cell. We are not going to be using create new spreadsheet, and we are not going to replace the spreadsheet. If you select replace spreadsheet, you will lose all of the data in your workbook. That means all of the tabs, all of the data, all of that type of stuff. So I would highly recommend you do not use replace spreadsheet. The simplest way to get a new set of data into a workbook is using the insert new sheets function. So you can see down here we have 5 tabs already in here, and when we insert this new sheet, it is merely going to pull in the data tab with the title of the workbook and then the range that we're importing in here. This is really effective if you have multiple sets of data that you want to pull into one environment. But for the purposes of constructing a workflow to update data, the replace sheet method is very impactful. What that enables you to do is to create destinations for your data, like I have, where I have tabs set up with intentional purposes. And when I replace the current sheet, you'll notice that it doesn't change the name of the tab. It merely pulls in the data so that now it's accessible in this destination, which means I can point other tabs to it. An example of pointing to another tab is what I'm about to do here, where I'm creating a new column in the data set that I've brought in called country code. And I'm going to use a VLOOKUP function in order to map the country code to the countries in the data set. So I'm going to go to this lookups tab in my workbook, and I'm going to select the data that I want to reference, and then I'm going to look up the country code, and then I'm going to add that country code to all of my data in here. So you can see that each item is mapping to the country code in the lookups tab. This is where leveraging an import method is going to be really impactful, because if you have visualizations like tables or charts that reference one tab in your workbook, you can consistently update those resources and create pipelines within your spreadsheet. Now, the drawback to replacing sheet is that if you do add additional data points to the data that you're importing, if that data changes or you need to update it for any reason, such as like line items being added or removed, if you attempt to replace the current sheet again, it will overwrite everything in the workbook. So you can see that column with all of my lookups has now been replaced because we're literally replacing the entire sheet. One way that you can overcome that is by using replace data at selected cell. Now, the cool thing about replace data at selected cell is that it will only import the data that you have. So you'll see in here, I'm adding X's to the bottom of my data range. You can see that I have VLOOKUPs in here for the country code, but I have nothing to look up against. So I'm going to go back to the import menu. And I'm going to go to replace data at selected cell, the very last option in the import location dropdown. And when I drop that in, you'll now see that I have not overwritten my lookups. Now, I did overwrite my X's down here because I had enough data to overwrite them, but you'll notice that this X did not get overwritten over here. That's because the data is self-contained to this column and this row. Now, the one challenge that comes with this method is that if your data has less rows than what the data in your sheet has, when you attempt to replace data at the selected cell, it will not overwrite the pre-existing sets of data. So, for example, our current data in the import replace data at selected cell tab has 30 rows of data. When we go back to our data tab and we go to this data short environment, you'll see that we only have 9 rows of data. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to extract that data and I'm going to attempt to replace the data in this workbook. So I'm going to go to File, I'm going to go to Import, I'm going to Upload, and I'm going to reference data short now, and I'm going to replace data at selected cell. Now, what you'll notice in here is that we have all 9 rows of data from our previous workbook tab, right? So you can see we go to row 9, but then you'll notice that we still have all of that leftover data from the previous iteration of when we loaded in data. The way that you can overcome this is you have to clear out your data set in order to import in your short data. But the challenge with doing that is that then it adds an additional manual step to your workflow. That's why my recommendation would be, if you are adding in data sets to a pipeline, it's best to replace the current sheet because it will flush out all of the data for you, right? So if we go back into our replace sheet method and we try to pull in our short data here, right? It will remove all of the data from the workbook without holding over the previous iteration of our ingestion method. Now, the drawback here is that you can't do any markup in the replace sheet tab, but it is a more streamlined method, more efficient method of pulling data in so that you can create new tabs in your workbook in order to modify data, which we'll discuss in future videos. The final option that I want to talk about is for when you have data that you want to build on top of. So let's say that you extract data on a daily, weekly, monthly basis where you want to add rows to a pre-existing data set. You'll see that I have a set of data in here that is marked in red, and let's say that this is from the 1st of the month through the 10th day of the month, and then I go to a data set where I have, data from the 11th day of the month to the 20th day of the month. Instead of having to reload all of that data, I can append it to the current sheet, which will just add it on to the bottom. So you'll now see that in addition to our red data set up there, we now have another set of data below it. This is really impactful when you're extracting data from an analytics portal that caps the amount of data that you can extract. This enables you to pull in a single month's set of data so that you can extract each month and then add it up so that you have a table that has the totality of all of your data. Now, the most impactful option that you have is the import range method. Import range has two arguments. The first one is the spreadsheet URL. So we're going to go into our data tab. We're going to copy the URL. We're going to use double quotes because you'll note in the documentation that it says you need a double quote and then a URL and then a double quote. So we're going to paste our full URL in there. We're going to do a double quote. We'll use a comma. And then the second argument is going to reference the range. So our data set is in the data tab from column A through F. So we're going to add a double quote and we're going to type in data. And then we're going to add an exclamation point because you can see in the documentation you need to reference the name with an exclamation point and then the range of data. And then we're going to type A with a colon and then F, and then we're going to do a double quote, and then we're going to hit enter. And then we're going to get this reference error, and it says that you need to connect these sheets. You allow access, and then all of your data populates. Now, the great thing about this method, this function, is that it will dynamically respond to changes. So we're going to go back to our source data set in here, and we're going to remove some data. Once we go back to our sheet, you'll see that it has dynamically responded to those adjustments. We're going to delete all these empty rows in here. And then you'll see that those rows also get deleted without us having to do anything. This is a dynamic method of importing data into your sheet, and one that I think is going to serve a lot of people's needs. The one thing that I want to caution you against is if you wanted to do some type of manual markup where you say Mark is from the UK. If that row with Mark in it gets deleted, that manual markup is not going to be joined to it, right? So we're going to delete this row, and now you can see that instead of it aligning with Mark is from the UK, it's now associated with a row for Danny is from the UK. So you need to be careful with the way that you leverage import ranges because you don't want to hard code data in there. If you did some type of string formatting based upon the cell references where you say like the cell is being referenced instead of the hard coding, then that's totally fine. Because what's going to happen then is you're going to be deleting Danny is from the UK, and then you'll have that logic stick with it. But of course, you can see that that is then going to result in extra values down here. Now, there's ways that we're going to discuss in future videos of how to cut down on these issues. But for the purposes of step one, getting the data into the environment, I would caution against building logic on top of that when leveraging import range. Your import range should focus on the very intentional purpose of moving data from one place to another, and then coming up with secondary solutions to add to that data, augment that data, make that data more impactful. The last thing that I want to talk about as it pertains to import range and some of these strategies is leveraging import range beyond its effectiveness. So I've created a new sheet in here called breaker example. And what breaker example is going to do is it's going to reference this breaker tab in my data worksheet. Now, what I've come into contact with throughout my career is single purpose workbooks that expand over time, right? So people like to maintain data records that span multiple years that are often referred to as like the source of truth for data collection when automated solutions don't exist around like databasing, data warehousing, data laking, that type of stuff. So what they'll do is they'll expand their data out over like, you know, 30, 40, 50 columns, and then thousands of rows. So you'll see that this data spans more than 10,000 rows and well over 30, 35 columns, whatever it is. So if I attempt to use breaker in import range, you'll see that import range will not be able to process all this information. So I attempt to do it, and I literally get an error message that says that the results are too large. The reason for this is because import range has a set number of cells that it can bring into an environment. I don't recall what it is off the top of my head, but effectively, you will get to a point where you have too many columns, or you have too many rows, or you have too many cells, and import range will no longer work. Additionally, if you push import range too hard, it will slow down. So those dynamic updates that you saw when we were in this import range tab will start to lag, and in some cases they will freeze, which means that updates will happen to the source material that will not feed into the workbook that is leveraging the import range. So when you think about using import range, make sure that you don't overuse import range, right? You don't want to have too many import ranges in one workbook because you will slow down your data pipelines and you will potentially leave yourself vulnerable to expecting automatic updates that are no longer functioning in an optimal fashion. So import range should be thought of as a short to mid-term solution while you expand your toolkit and your knowledge set to leverage more sustainable long-term methods of moving data from one environment to another. So that's it for this video. I hope you found it helpful. I'm always interested in feedback, so please leave comments or suggestions. And check out for more videos that talk about ways to sustainably leverage data within Google Sheets.